Hi, I'm Dr. Randall White. I'm a clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of British Columbia. The BC Mental Health Act is a law that allows doctors to keep patients in a hospital. Under the act, they're called designated facilities, in order to do assessment and treatment. And this is typically in the case of people with severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. In order for a doctor to keep a patient in hospital under the Mental Health Act, the patient has to, first of all, have a diagnosis of a severe mental disorder. Second of all, the person has to be affected by that disorder at that moment in time, such that their behavior, their ability to make decisions are adversely affected, and that could put them at risk to either do something that could harm themselves, that could harm other people, or that they could have some deterioration mentally or physically. Also, that person's disorder can be suitably treated in a hospital, and that the supervision and care they would get would help them. And finally, the act says that the person is not suitable as a voluntary patient. And what that typically means is that the person lacks insight, they don't understand that they have a disorder that's adversely affecting their behavior, they're at risk, and therefore they're not willing to stay in hospital voluntarily. When people are affected by the most severe mental illnesses, their behaviors can become disorganized. They become, sometimes victims of aggression. Occasionally they may commit aggression. So these are the kinds of things that can occur that require somebody to get immediate or emergency help. The Mental Health Act really prevents people from having severe ongoing mental illness, from injuries, from victimization, from deterioration in the streets, from also ending up in jail. The Mental Health Act, for instance, has a section that allows police to bring people to hospital if they think that the behaviors that the person has could be related to mental illness. And perhaps they committed a minor crime. It's much more beneficial, despite that, for the person to come to a hospital. It's much more humane than sending them to jail, where they may not get appropriate assessment, they may not get treatment, and they may be victimized further. I've had more than one patient who was angry or confused about why they were kept in hospital. And at first they were asking to leave as soon as possible, or they were calling their family asking, "Why am I here? Please get me out of here." They were suspicious, they were afraid of the nurses, they were rejecting medications. These are all quite typical when people are very paranoid, very agitated. Once they begin to get better, they often start to gain insight. And I've had someone tell me, I really didn't like this. I really hated being here initially, but if it weren't for this, I'd be on the street, or I could have ended up, who knows, even dead if I hadn't come here. And so even though this was upsetting at first and scary, I'm glad. These illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, they affect everyone in the household. They don't know where to turn for help. The mental health system itself is confusing. So it's really essential that those people who are living with a person affected understand what's going on. And there's so much stigma and sometimes guilt associated that they really need support and education. So that's the first thing, explaining what the diagnosis is. It's not anyone's fault, and that there are treatments, that there is hope for improvement. And I think that's really the key thing. People are often very baffled and confused initially, so they can't absorb a lot of information. But another thing that I do is I tell them about the BC Schizophrenia Society. I tell them about the resources that are on the website, that there are meetings, that there are education programs. And when they're ready, they will find that information, and in the long run, that's probably the most important thing, that they get that kind of ongoing support and education.
Okay, So before we begin today's education session, I have the great honor of introducing a very special guest, the BC Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, Minister Sheila Malcolmson. Minister Malcolmson continues to demonstrate her commitment over and over and over again and make significant changes to show her support of families throughout the entire province. And I know many people and many organizations, including BCSS, have greatly benefited from this dedication and her commitment. Minister Malcolmson, thank you for being here today, but more than that, thank you for everything that you've done for BCSS and for families across the province. Thank you for being here today.
Phaedra, thank you. Thank you so much, Phaedra, and welcome to all of your team, all of the families and guests and speakers. I know I'm joining a really rich conversation, and I'm grateful for you, including me in your lineup and being able to bring the voice of the provincial government. I know that the Premier, John Horgan, as he wraps up his time of service, would want me to extend greetings to everybody that's doing really challenging work during really challenging times. And also Minister Adrian Dix, you know what a supporter he is, and the $5 million in funding that we together brought to BC Schizophrenia Society this spring that we got to announce together. That was a lot of it because of Minister Dick's particular push. And so we're part of a team here, as I know that you're part of a team. I want to start by recognizing I'm on the territory of Nanaimo First Nation. That's a real place of healing and such support and education for me in my role as the second Minister of Mental Health and Addictions in British Columbia. And I also can't start speaking without recognizing the incredible and powerful and caring work that's being done by your society's service providers and by the families and members. It's an exceptionally difficult time in the area of mental health and addictions in the province. And I know your members and families know that particularly well. You've been doing very difficult work for a very long time. And so we're learning from you. I'm going to try to speak, in a couple of hopeful notes about some of the work that we're doing, informed by your work and informed by what we've heard from people on the front line and people with lived experience, building that system of care that wasn't in place in 2017 when we formed government. And I don't mean to make a partisan hit here. We just had a decade and a half of underinvestment in the sector while the challenges and pressures on people grew. And so whether that's housing or training new healthcare workers or building up the programs and supports that we should have had in place, I wish that we'd been further ahead when both the public health emergencies hit us, both COVID and the overdose crisis. And here we are working every day, almost every week. Just on Thursday, I was in Cranbrook opening another 10 publicly funded addiction treatment beds, half of them for young people. Almost every week, we're adding more services. And with everything I say, it's all within the frame of there is much more to do. We are still losing far too many people to mental health and substance use challenges. And there is a lot more work for us to do. But I do want to speak just about a couple of the programs that we have been able to add. One of the ones that I think has particular resonance with the conversation today is the early psychosis intervention funding that came out of the 2021 budget and continues to be implemented across the province. That's $53 million. In every health authority, new programs are being added. And one of the particular partnerships, because I know so much of the conversation that we are doing together is about partnerships, is the co-location of the early psychosis intervention services that the health authorities are offering with Foundry centers. And if you haven't tapped into Foundry yet, I hope that you and your family members will. You can download it as an app, Foundry BC. That's something that province is funding. But we also have, I believe it's now 12 Foundries open across British Columbia. And altogether, there will be 23 when we finish implementation. A place that is designed for and by young people up to ages 26. The intersection of primary health care, sexual health, contraception, but particularly the counseling on mental health and substance use is literally life-saving, let alone the partnerships that get built out from Foundries to health authorities, to school districts. In many cases, people that have are suspicious of the healthcare system are able to get connected to health and build trust and relationships and the ability to get help with Foundry. And then the access, the fact that we're directly embedding early psychosis intervention within many Foundry centers, I think is a particularly important example of you can walk through a peer-led organization into a more traditional healthcare setting, but that means the threshold is easier to cross. I'm going to talk about another new service that I think is relevant that has been added, but this is a really good place to add to say again the role of BC Center for the BC Schizophrenia Society. While we have not been in a place in British Columbia to get timely care and access, I mean, we want as the end goal when people reach out for help that they get help that is designed for them, that they get it fast, that they get it where they live, because we know that intervening early can prevent a lifetime of harm and of the anguish in some cases of mental illness and schizophrenia in particular. But in the meantime, BCSS has been there. The outreach to families that are struggling and don't know where to turn, the camaraderie, the support of each other has been vital, filling that gap. And so I'm grateful to you. I want to talk to us for a minute too about another program that I think has particular intersection, complex care housing, which is designed for people that have been challenged retaining the housing that they have. They tend to be evicted because of maybe acquired brain injury, but particularly mental health and substance use challenges. Complex care housing is a commitment not to evict, because we know that people can't access healthcare unless they have secure housing. But another piece that's in the mix is in relation to criminality on the street that has its roots in substance use and untreated mental illness. I want your members, and especially in the conversation that you're going to have this afternoon, to be really clear. Complex care housing is voluntary, and it is healthcare delivered because it is a healthcare service that has been, that people have been alienated from. And we're now working with health authorities. We will house 500 people by the time that this particular part of the program is finished, and there's more to do, and it'll be in every corner of the province. But as you hear some of the dialogue and rhetoric out there about criminality that is not being attended to, I just want your members to be totally clear that complex care housing is not designed for people that are doing crimes, whether they're crimes of poverty or addiction, doesn't matter. Complex care housing is a healthcare support. We will hear and are hearing already that changes to the Mental Health Act, changes to the Federal Criminal Code might be necessary for people's very well-founded concerns about stranger violence, about people on the streets that are making other people feel unsafe. But I want you to be very clear and understand that our government understands well that criminal behavior is one thing, but we do have a lot of people that have deserved all their life more care than they have had. We're determined to build the system that gets it for them. And that is not about, about being put in jail. That is about being met where they are. And finally, I'll finish by saying, as we do have this dialogue as a province, I know that the voices of your families and members about people's experience under the Mental Health Act, people's experience with involuntary treatment and involuntary admission, is the complexity of those conversations will be of benefit to my entire government, will be of benefit to local governments as they're being elected and in elections today, will be important to some of the rhetoric that is out there. So we're able to clearly assert that there are multiple paths of people being able to access the care and the treatment that they support. We want to treat people with dignity, and your voices, your experiences, within our existing system of care, and your vision for how this system of care could be better built is going to be extremely valuable to me and our whole government. And so I'll finish by saying thank you for the dialogue you're going to have this afternoon. Thank you for the friendship and partnership, and I look forward to more conversations. Thank you, Phaedra, again for the invitation and the opportunity.
Oh, Minister Malcolmson, thank you so much for being here today. And like I said, thank you for being here today, but more than that, just thank you for your ongoing support. I always enjoy seeing you. And we as an organization applaud the provincial government and commend you for your continued support for people living with chronic and persistent mental illnesses, and for all that you've done, and for supporting our families across the entire province. So thank you for everything that you've done personally and our government. Thank you for your continued support. It truly means the world to us. Thank you. And I'm going to be turning the floor over to Hardeep. And she, I'm sure all of you know Hardeep. She is the BCSS Coastal Regional Manager. But before doing that, I really just want to say thank you again to the entire team for putting on this event today. And to Dave Helikowski, who I've had the great honor of working with the past 3 years. And I know I was joking before, Dave, that I wasn't going to let you go, and that is true. You've been a huge support to me these past 3 years, and I know you're passing the torch to Jack. So I know this organization is going to be in very good hands, but I just wanted to say thanks again, Dave. Okay, Hardeep, over to you for this very special presentation. And once again, a special thank you to AbbVie for being today's sponsor. Hardeep, take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Phaedra. And I just want to echo what you said earlier. It's incredible to have these speakers before us. And I've had the great fortune of knowing Fred and David for a very long time as well. And they've done amazing work for our organization. So I too am eternally grateful for that work. I'd just like to welcome you and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this special session, A Tool for Wellness, the BC Mental Health Act. And Dr. Randall White's video was excellent. I think it had an excellent perspective and really nice and concise, and help us understand why we have this act and really how it can help us and how we can use it. So very, very important information. So thank you very much again, Dr. Randall White, for putting that piece together for us. As educators with BCSS, it's probably the most important call that we get from families is, picking up the call and just people in distress about how do I get my loved one into help when they're not willing to go and seek treatment, any form of treatment themselves. So I'm very honored this afternoon to have Dr. Vijay Seethapathy join us. He is an amazing speaker, and he will be giving us a little bit more detailed information about the BC Mental Health Act. If you have any questions, and we would like to use the Q&A and not the chat feature, so I'm making sure we got that point clear. So as he's speaking and something pops into your mind, please jot it down in the Q&A, and we will get to your questions at the end of the presentation. Dr. Seethapathy is the Chief Medical Officer at BC Mental Health and Substance Use Services. As part of the DIAD leadership team, Chief Operating Officer Jennifer Duff. He provides strategic and operational oversight for medical services across the BCMHSUS programs and services, including the Forensic Psychiatric Hospital, Redfish Center for Mental Health and Addiction, Heartwood Center for Women, Correctional Health Services, Forensic Regional Clinics, and Provincial Specialized Mental Health and Substance Use programs. Dr. Seethapathy is also a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at UBC, where he oversees the Psychiatry Residence Addictions program. He is also one of very few psychiatrists in BC who specializes in treating patients with a combination of complex mental health and substance use disorders, known in the mental health community as concurrent disorders. He also has a special interest in clinical systems redesign. Dr. Seethapathy has bachelor's degrees in medicine and surgery from India, and an executive master's degree in business administration from Keele University in the UK. He is a diplomat of the American Board of Addiction Medicine, a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, and a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of Canada. Wow, incredible. But before we have a chance to hear from Dr. Seethapathy, we would like to share 2 personal videos of family members and 1 video of a person with lived experience sharing their experiences of the Mental Health Act.
About 2 years ago, our child had a psychotic episode here at our home. Our child ransacked the house looking for files in regards to a conspiracy that we had taken all their money along with the government and the banks and were robbing them of their finances. So anything to do with finances became a huge delusional paranoia. Lots of anger directed towards us, lots of aggression directed towards us, and other visual hallucinations were things like people were losing their faces. Our child refused help, and then after that, for the next 1.5 years or so, 2 years, still living independently, but lost their work and eventually lost all finances. So that's been there with the deterioration in the living conditions were becoming much more drastic with absolute refusal to accept that there was a problem.
I was told a number of times that unless our loved one asks for help, accepts help, that there is nothing that we can do. Unless, of course, they hurt themselves or they hurt somebody else. And it wasn't until the BCSS and the amazing people there that we found out that, yes, there were things you can do. The BCSS brought it down to 3 things. We gave collateral information, and the doctor can maybe have our loved one committed. We can get the police involved, or we can go for a judge's warrant.
The police helped us to force our child to go to the hospital with us. We went to the Access Center in Vancouver, where they recommended that our child stays, but our loved one said no, and they had to let them go. Then we tried sending letters to our family doctor, and we sent many letters and many phone calls and collateral information. We kept documenting it, etc. The short answer is the doctor said, unless your child comes to me for help, there's very little I can do. And so that was extremely frustrating for us. We heard from the BCSS that it wasn't a surprise. We then tried phoning some of the different mental health units, like the early psychosis intervention and the health team near to where our child lived, who were very sympathetic, but again, saying, unless your loved one comes in, there's very little we could do. So we tried the police, the Car 87, who were fantastic to us. They went and checked on our loved one, said that they suspected there was issues there, but because they weren't granted access to the suite and our loved one masks the symptoms very well to authority, they felt that there wasn't enough for them to bring our child in under the Mental Health Act, the Section 28, I believe it's called. They recommended, as well as the BCSS, that the next step would be the judge's warrant. We spent days writing up all the collateral information for the judge's warrant, and it was nerve-wracking to think that we're committing our child, and especially you have to go to the criminal registry to try and do this, but the judge was extremely empathetic, so we were granted the warrant and had our loved one picked up by Car 87 and taken to hospital.
We are so grateful that we went for the judge's warrant. It was the best thing we have ever done in our entire lives, because we know the way things were going, our son may not be alive today if we had not gone for the judge's warrant. So as scary as it actually was the best thing we could have done.
Schizophrenia or any mental illness isn't something that people are looking for in their children. It's really the furthest thing from your mind. What you're always thinking is that your children are going through angst. They're in high school, they're developing, they're doing all kinds of things. He was doing really well. You know, he was very smart. He'd taken all kinds of tests and he was in line to go to university. And we sort of didn't look that far. And then all of a sudden we started to realize that a little bit of darkness was coming. And by darkness, I mean he wasn't communicating. He was staying very quiet in his room for long lengths of time. And then one night we were sound asleep and Greg came and knocked on our door. He said, "My God, turn off that radio. Why have you got that radio on so loud?" And my husband sort of got up and he looked at me and he said, "Pat, I think we need to go. I think we need to take him and have him looked at." So we got Greg to come in the car with us, which was not easy. He didn't want to go. He thought everything was fine. And we got to the hospital and we were there for maybe 4 or 5 hours, and a doctor came down the hallway and he looked at us and he said, "Well," he said, "your son has schizophrenia." In the beginning, when Greg was first diagnosed, I would say for the first 2 or 3 years, he accepted the fact that he had an illness and he was adamant about taking his medications. But Greg had an unfortunate incident where he was on a SkyTrain and he saw a young girl that was being harassed by some men on the SkyTrain. So Greg went over and he said, "Hey, you know, come on, leave her alone. Just leave her alone." And they beat him up very badly. So we were called to come to the hospital, actually, that he had been involved in this incident on the SkyTrain. And unfortunately, the police officer that was there asked Greg, "Are you taking any medications? Have you been diagnosed with anything?" Greg took this to mean, oh, if I have a mental illness, then they're not going to believe me. They're not going to trust me. They're not going to think I'm telling the truth. And that was the beginning of probably 23, 24 years of a fight to try to keep him online, try to keep him with his medications. Hence, there were times when we had to have him go to the hospital. We had to. He was a danger to himself at that point. So we had to find ways of getting him into the hospital. We've taken Greg to the hospital 9 times. 3 times he was actually admitted. The other 6 times were probably one of the most frustrating experiences of our lives, in that here we had an individual who was obviously in need of care and assistance. Involuntary treatment helped Greg, in that it was a way of getting him into the hospital, something that was absolutely needed. So involuntary means that the medical staff actually has a time, and there is a time frame for them to be able to look at the person holistically and to see what else is going on in their bodies. The problem with it is that it doesn't last long enough. A doctor can say, "I don't want him to leave. I want him to stay in the hospital." The nurse can say that, the psychiatrist can say that, and it can go to a panel because it's an involuntary admission into the hospital, and the panel can let him go. After our paid professionals that work in this area are saying they want to keep this person in, they want to help this person more, and yet Greg can request a panel and they can let him go from the hospital. This makes no sense to me. There's so many things that parents or loved ones have to do to ensure that your loved one is going to get the care that they need.
Schizophrenia impacted me when I was 24 years old. I didn't realize, but I had become psychotic. But I was also in mania, but I didn't know what either of those was. So I just felt like life was such a huge high at that point. Eventually, I was working on the farm. I started to notice the land was talking to me. And I'm a little bit of a hippie, so I just thought that was me connecting to the land. Eventually, though, it did get worse. The voices at first were just coming from the trees, the sky, the ocean, but then it pivoted. No longer being what I thought was the land talking to me, it ended up being what sounded like human voices. All of a sudden, you are worthless, you should die. This whole experience you made up in your mind, nothing actually exists. I didn't understand what was happening at that point. I started listening to the voices all the time. I started to lose kind of my perception of reality and start to do whatever the voices told me. And then I eventually became homeless within that time. One day I started talking to the voices and they led me to my friend's house. They told me to smash my friend's window and I gave my friend eye contact as I smashed their window. And then they brought me to the hospital. I was so delusional and disoriented that I didn't fully know what was going on. There came a point where they finally had me admitted to talk to a psychiatrist. I didn't even know they were a psychiatrist. At that point, I started seizuring, and I could feel what I felt at the time, like the voices were trying to come out of me internally. I was under the axe, so I wasn't free to go on my own will. So they kept me there for several days, but then eventually they just discharged me. The psychiatrist said I was exhibiting signs of schizophrenia, but there was no follow-up. I was just discharged. And I could have been more honest, but at that point I did not want to be there. So I knew, well, I don't want them to keep me here prolonged. I'm going to act as normal as possible. If I had been more honest though, they would have found out I had nowhere to go. So I ended up just being discharged and becoming homeless again. I'm a little bit upset that they didn't seem to mind rushing my discharge. After being discharged, I started having a few extra moments of clarity where I'd all of a sudden realize I'm homeless, this is not good. And then I started to realize I do need some support of some kind, even if I wasn't willing to admit how much. So I eventually got some support through a local band in my community, and then they redirected me to getting mental health support. And that started the journey of very, very slowly getting better. It was not an easy road. It took a lot of time. I'm always still working on my mental health. I'll always have to kind of work at maintaining it to a certain degree. Currently, I work within Peer Support, which is a program that supports people with their mental health. So I oversee the Peer Support program. I just got promoted to the manager of that program. I also do tenant management for Supportive Housing Society, which supports people with housing that's affordable who also struggle with their mental health. Things that have helped me since going through that experience, feel that it's valid to share what I've gone through, that I don't have to hide my struggles. That's probably been the most positive thing for me, is to normalize how easy it is to struggle and then to all of a sudden not know what to do and not to feel okay.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you to Melanie and Ron, Pat and Hardy, and Adria for sharing such insightful information for all of us in hopes to help other families. We certainly appreciate your vulnerability and honesty in doing this video for all of us to be able to witness. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Seethapathy. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to hearing the presentation.
Thank you so much, Hardeep, and thanks so much for BCSS for having me here. And it's a complex topic, and you guys have nicely summarized some of the challenges in the videos. What you've seen, it's not an easy solution to kind of come up with some of the challenges what we face. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to share some background about the Mental Health Act. And we're going to talk a little bit more into some of the challenges we see and what I hear from the families and loved ones, very similar to what we have heard today in some of those videos. So let me just jump into my presentation, and then please, if you have, I'm hoping you'll have a lot of questions, and it's not an easy topic, as I said. We're happy to answer. Please put the questions into the Q&A section, please. That'd be very helpful, and we will we'll do our best to answer some of those questions after my presentation. My presentation is going to be about less than 20 minutes, and I'll do my best to kind of keep up with the time. So I'm just going to share my screen now. All right. Okay. Yeah, first of all, I would like to just take a minute to acknowledge with gratitude that we are all gathered, particularly like myself, I'm gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish Nation, Tsleil-Waututh Nation, who have nurtured and cared for these lands and waters around us for all the time. I'm grateful to be here and talking to you from these lands. Okay, so before I jump into the Mental Health Act, I think it's important to understand a bit of background, what has happened in BC. So once we get a bit of background, it kind of puts a few perspectives into place and helps us understand why we're facing some of the challenges today, and helpful to kind of start looking at what solutions we may need to kind of start addressing going forward. So if you look at BC, like, we're talking about, the first recorded insanity case was about 1800 or 1850. And fast forward about 100 years, we're talking about the Riverview Hospital, many of you know, at the Riverview grounds. And we were one of the largest, we used to call them like mental health asylum at the time. And it is close to 5,000 patients. It's can never be done or replicated anytime now, and neither it should be replicated in that way because of the treatments and options and the care closer to home and all the other service and clinical pathways what we have. And while the Riverview was running at its peak, just before the time, like, we can see that, chlorpromazine, one of this wonder drug came in, then haloperidol came in, and then several other medications came in. So they started to look at, okay, what do? We don't have to lock people up, people suffering from mental health issues. So if you want to use the trauma-informed way and try to support these clients, the important thing is to kind of bring the care closer to home. So while doing care closer to home, the important thing was to look at some of the safeguards and making sure that we have safeguards for the clients, because one of the most important thing about the mental health and mental illness, particularly psychosis and schizophrenia, we call it a disorder of mind, a disorder of thought process. So many clients, when they suffer from this illness, they are unable to kind of differentiate the reality. And many of the reality-based delusions and misperceptions does happen. So it's important to have some treatment paradigm and also some safety net. So the BC Mental Health Act was introduced, and it was introduced across, Mental Health Act was introduced in several jurisdictions in the Western country around that time. And the BC Mental Health Act has evolved from then. And then we had the version of 1999, which we particularly used, and then update in 2005. Which was done as per the Mental Health Act. And it's a 206-page document. I've kind of pulled out some of those pointers. It's not going to be easy for me to kind of fill all those valuable information and some of those nuances in this 15-20 minutes. I'll do my best. And again, we will talk about for certain topics which may be helpful for here. So then we looked at the review getting closed in about 10 years ago. And then we were trying to look at the community-based treatment, putting clients back into the community and helping them to kind of settle down. But I have to kind of be careful when I say that. And then the challenge is that, when we had a review, we had services all under one roof, mostly, may not be ideal. But then when we kind of start to kind of bring the care closer to home, there's a lot of problems with the equities, access issues, appropriate care. And hence, we're seeing the problem around the Mental Health Act related admissions, and also increased number of Mental Health Act admissions. So not necessarily like Mental Health Act admissions, increasing that number is not good. That's my opinion over it. So why do we need Mental Health Act? I touched a little bit upon. So most situation, a person is free to refuse treatment, even if it's a physical, and believe that even if the physician believes that's in the patient's or person's best interest. This is generally applicable for all the medical related issues. When it comes to Mental Health Act, as I mentioned, that there's a disorder of mind and disorder of thought process, and it becomes difficult for the client to delineate some of the reality-based stuff versus what is illness versus what is the belief system and what the difficulties they face. So hence the physician may require to kind of look at the best interest of the client and start to look at some treatment recommendation. And it may appear that they're treating against the will, and it would be deemed as violating the person's autonomy. So it's a thin line. I heard this videos about review boards and a club physician versus review board, how they perceive things, some of the challenges when we face, like when we take the client to the hospital. But the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom is one of the most liberal and fantastic charter rights what we have in Canada. It's coming with the balance in the Charter of Rights and Freedom, and also looking at the Mental Health Act and where do we draw this line, and ensuring that we provide the care safely, timely, but also ensuring that it is not too restrictive. We're not taking away the liberties of the clients in any manner. But naturally, we have to take perspective of the families all the time, and that's very important. I'll go through that in the later part of my presentation. Okay, so I already mentioned about what's BC Mental Health Act, and the purpose of the Mental Health Act is to ensure the treatment of the mentally disordered who need protection and care by providing the authority and criteria and procedures for involuntary admission to treatment. So I think many of you may know that and know why we do that and the reasons for that. It's important I put this BC Supreme Court decision there because some of these interpretation, because we look at the Mental Health Act, it's a very broad. I mean, we're talking about 26 pages of legislative document, and the guide is about 206 pages. I mean, that's the kind of interpretation and guide which comes with it. Even there are areas which is still very vague and is left up to interpretation. So it's very important to also look at some of the case laws and some of the court decisions, what has happened, and how does impacts on our applicability of the Mental Health Act, our interpretation of the Mental Health Act. So what in the McCorkle and Riverview Hospital case in 1993 states that we really looked at the protection issue. We talked about the protection of the self or protection of others, but the Mental Health Act does go beyond physical dangerousness and need not be evidenced by a physical blow, threats, or delusions, can also support the need for protection. What that means is basically you don't have to have assaultive behavior, severe suicidal behavior, which is deemed to be called dangerousness or protection, but it could be evidenced by issues related to their finances. There's a significant harm in terms of how they relate to their family, significant concern about how they relate to their vocations, job. That can be taken into account. It doesn't have to be always the protection of self or others means it's a violence or suicide. So that's an important point. So when we have a client like who's involved, who is kind of buying a car or a few cars or spending a big amount of money, or appears like quite thought disordered, unable to engage with the family or friends in an appropriate manner. So that could also be classed as a protection. So you don't have to have significant or severe dangerousness or violence attached to the protection. So it does be important to kind of note that point there. I mean, this graph tells for itself. We've seen that the closure of review, and as I mentioned, that I don't think we've had all the appropriate care and treatment. I heard from Minister Sheila Malcolmson. There's a lot of effort has been put in place in terms of early intervention and access to care. One of the biggest challenge we have is access to treatment in a timely fashion and appropriate way. If somebody has early symptoms, you want to get them within 4 weeks I'm talking about like to get them as soon as possible, but at least 4 weeks of the standards as per the Canadian guidelines, which talks about psychosis, schizophrenia, that one should have a comprehensive assessment. But we don't have in many neighborhoods ability to kind of have primary care or psychiatry or access to urgent care for mental health. So that becomes a bit of an issue in terms of getting the clients go through a significant deterioration in health. And naturally, you're going to see an increased number of Mental Health Act certification, which could happen in the community. So we're really looking at about 15,000, which was like a few years ago. This is also important. I talk about why I mentioned about the appropriateness of service, timeliness of the service that's available within our province. So again, there's a lot of suggestions and evidence and research have been gone in terms of, okay, 1/5 of BC residents experience serious mental disorder. This is 2002, but we are pandemic now, post-pandemic. Stress does have an impact on serious mental health issues. Trauma has a big problem. People do have substance use issues. So that's becoming a huge outcry for the last 4 years. So we're seeing significant other comorbidities and other conditions which could impact the mental health. And I don't really think like it's going to be 1/5. It's going to be much higher than that in BC currently, but we don't have a latest data to support that right now. We also looked at the mental health hospitals that reduced the bed from 65,000 to 21,000. So I don't have an exact number of beds within the BC population, but the significant number of beds have been reduced. And we're talking about Riverview time to now. But again, matching services, which needs to support the clients, is not being available. So hence, you're going to have a huge problem. What also has happened is, like, because of this, the prison population has kind of doubled and tripled. And we're talking about, like, it keeps increasing. One of an interesting study, which a couple of studies which came from North America, even one from last year, they really look at the prison population with significant mental health issues and what happened to the hospital bed. And they kind of mapped them into a curve. And what happened to found is, like, the prison population has gone up, the hospital beds have come down, and we significantly have people like, who are actually being in the other part of the system, either they're not being cared for appropriately, either in community or prison, or getting locked up in cells, which may not be appropriate or ideal. And when the clients come out and naturally in the community, they can't cope, and they need to be certified to be brought back to the hospital just to see where we go and what we do for them and how do we support them. This is the additional factors which we take into account. We're talking about a long wait list to see psychiatrists in the community. Some of the neighborhoods, people who are here, I'm not talking something like which you are not aware of. So we don't have primary care. We don't have psychiatrists in many communities. And they could be waiting for a year, 2, or even longer in some communities to have timeliness of access. And they've also studied done about 1999. If we do the study now, it'd be very interesting to see how many years it takes to access treatment. It's 3 years for schizophrenia in 1999. And I heard from Honorable Minister Sheila Malcolmson that money has been, funds have been kind of channeled into the early psychosis and early intervention programs. I'm glad to hear that. I'm hoping that we're going to kind of narrow that gap and start to give timely access so that we don't have to end up detaining everybody under the Mental Health Act. So the 4 criteria of admission, which I think were very eloquently said by Dr. Randall White, and we're talking about react appropriately due to the mental disorder, unable to associate with others, again due to mental disorder, require psychotic treatment in or through the designated facility, require care and supervision and control, to prevent substantial mental or physical deterioration, to person's own protection. We talked about the protection. I mentioned that the protection doesn't mean it has to be significant severity. It could be protection for physical, family, social, vocational, etc. So it's important as families and friends and carers that we could strongly advocate using some of these clauses. And it's important for us to know that this clause can be used under Mental Health Act in case we need to certify a client and take them to hospital. And naturally, they cannot be suitably admitted as a voluntary patient. One has to fulfill all the 4 criteria. So that's important. So I mentioned about the case laws and the cases before, and how it helps us interpret and shape our Mental Health Act going forward. I mentioned about the McCorkle and Riverview Hospital case. There's also Merrick K 2008. It's a tragic story. I think some of you might have heard about it. So we're really talking about a client who tried to get admitted about 16 times. Sister takes him to hospital. The physician who see the client did not feel that MK was, that the client was dangerous according to the criteria. And we're talking about significant safety and protection, and was unaware or did not understand the physician that substantial mental deterioration was grounds for admission under other criteria. So we still could admit people. Again, they did fulfill the criteria, but the substantial mental deterioration was left open. So by the substantial mental deterioration, the Mental Health Act has given this broad kind of signing off authority to say, okay, hey, we could actually use that clause to prevent substantial deterioration, and hence we may be able to help people. It doesn't have to have protection all the time. It could be either or. It could be substantial mental deterioration or protection. And you could use one of the criteria for number 3, and then the other 3 criteria need to be fulfilled, and still we can admit the clients into hospital. So the next one is the involuntary admission. This is like what happens when the client need to be certified. And again, I just want to bring this Malcolmson-Levy's case in the Form 4. Form 4 is used to certify the client, to take them back for 48 hours, take them into the hospital or designated facility for up to 48 hours. And it's important to note that Malcolmson-Levy's case in 2002, and it does challenge that the need for personal interview, but it's kind of an understanding. People think that you have to do a personal interview for the client before you can admit the client or complete the Form 4. But this Malcolmson-Levy case clearly talks about you don't require a personal interview. It could be observation, or the interview could be unsafe or even impossible sometimes to do it. And the examination meant observing the person, reviewing the patient charts, reviewing the available history, collateral information from families and loved ones. And then through that, and if the physician feels that there's sufficient to gather reliable information and fulfill the 4 criteria, they can still complete the Form 4 and then send the client to the hospital. And again, even the second form could be done within the hospital. Now, some clients may not be very open to engage, and they could take collateral. So this is where the families could play a key role. If the client is admitted to hospital or taken to the hospital, please ensure you connect with the hospital, either at the emergency room where the client is there, or if they're admitted onto a psych unit for 48 hours assessment period, make sure you connect with the social worker or coordinator or the psychiatrist, so that you could advocate and you could actually share some of the concerns, which could then be appropriately and applicably used for the assessment for the Mental Health Act. So one such is, like, I think we heard that earlier on. So there are 3 ways you can admit people to hospital under the Mental Health Act. I mean, one is like you're talking about talking to a physician, the physician examines, or rare occasion that the physician unable to examine, you can still kind of give some of this information. And then you could potentially argue the case for a physician to complete in the rural remote sites where the physicians are unable to see or put their eyes on it. As long as the law states that if the physicians is working on the best interest and unable to do the follow through or unable to do the steps outlined, they could still take the collateral and applicably do the Form 4, even the first Form 4, and not just the second one alone. The second way of getting admitted for assessment would be the emergency procedures under Section 28. This is the police intervention. The police officer or constable may apprehend and immediately take the person to a physician for examination if satisfied from the personal observation or information received from the person is acting in a manner likely to endanger that person's own safety or safety of others, is apparently a person with mental disorder. So nothing is definite, conclusive. So these criteria could be applied, but this criteria is slightly more stricter to apply when it comes to the physician doing this criteria, because the safety criteria here, number A, has to be a bit heightened. So for the police to kind of take them, because they're not mental health workers, they're not clinicians and seeing the clients in the community. What's also important to note here, when a police officer constable may apprehend, apprehension is given again very broadly, and there's no definition given. So apprehension is not arrest. So their client is not deemed as arrested. They would be taken to the hospital using the Form 4, and Form 4 will allow them to take them, or the Section 28 could allow them to take. So apprehending, it doesn't mean equivalent to arrest. So I know it's traumatic, but it's not deemed as arrest. The third one, I think we heard from the video. So the involuntary admission and Schizophrenia Society have done some fantastic job advocating for some of the clients and clients' family to get the timely assessment in the hospital. And it's always helpful to have someone to help out and advocate and completing those criteria on the form, which called Form 9. And this is basically when it's not possible for a person with an apparent mental disorder to be examined by a physician or for the police to intervene, then the Act provides this method of arranging an involuntary admission. So it could be anyone with a family, neighbors, health professionals who has a good reason to believe a person has a mental disorder and apparently meets the criteria for involuntary admission, the same criteria we talked about, the criteria 1, 2, 3, 4, still need to be applied. But that's where we need the collateral information. The Form 9 is self-explanatory, what need to be completed. And then utilizing the services from BC Schizophrenia Society could be a very helpful option to kind of, if anybody needs to kind of exercise this option for their loved ones. So the judge, once they hear this information, doesn't have to be written format. The judge, there's also the clause which says that the family could also verbally report this through that Form 9 process, so that they could have the hearing with the judge, let them know about it, and the judge is satisfied with this information and the criteria are fulfilled. And if they're not able to get the person go through the normal process, that is getting the physician seen or getting seen by through a police, then the judge would issue a Form 10, we call it. That's a warrant, and that warrant could take the client into the hospital through the police, and the client could be kept in the hospital for up to 48 hours for further examination. But even the treatment as an emergency provision could be given during the 48 hours period. So this schematics is I just put it up here because if they're going to share my slides, and it's quite helpful. You don't have to search on the 206 pages of BC Mental Health Act guide. So this is taken from the BC Mental Health Act guide. You can see that on the left side, you can see the exam by the physician, and this is the section 28 traditional route. This is the police intervention, and we're talking about the judicial warrant here. I also put this slide up here. As I mentioned, that a lot of clients are now getting stuck or being served as mental health units in the jail. So in my role as the chief medical officer, so we provide the healthcare services for the last few years for all the provincial correctional services. And we've seen a huge number of clients that with the significant mental health issues, and it's been challenging to get timely care for these individuals. So in corrections, let's say one of your loved one is kind of going through those charges or court cases and then stuck in corrections. Corrections can also do the same assessment here. You can see they can examine by a physician, they can complete the Form 4, and they can actually be sent to the forensic hospital for further assessment and treatment. So the same help is available even there. And it's potentially good to kind of exercise this or advocate for this when the client is in the correctional facility. So involuntary admission to designated facilities, I put the slide up because some question comes up to say, what do I do when my loved ones are there? What happens when my loved ones actually go into the designated facilities? You can see that there are several forms that need to be completed. And I have to say that many of these forms are not getting completed in a proper manner. So we had an ombudsman audit commitment for change, and it basically highlighted that only 25% of these forms are being completed, and the client's rights are being upheld at the designated facilities across the province. So they've put certain safety measures to do this work, and clearly the Form 15, 16, 17 would be very helpful for families and loved ones to know, mainly because that's really how the families and the nearest relative could be more involved, which talks about nomination of nearest relative, notification of nearest relative, and also notification of nearest relative when client gets admitted, discharged, or when they ask for a review panel, and any notification with the status change from review panel also need to be notified by to the nearest relative too. Okay, so I'm just taking a little bit more time, and let me just try and see like I have to wrap that up. So this basically talks about the notification process of the nearest relative. So when the client goes to hospital, a social worker or a nurse gives the rights to the client, which is Form 13, which talks about why they are there, what supports they could have in terms of they want to appeal, and the reasons, the criteria for admission to hospital. And the client can also request for the Form 4, so certificate. And the family can also request for a copy of the certificates to see like what's been written. And if they have any additional information, they can still talk to and reach out to the hospital and share their concerns there. The Form 16 talks about the renewal, when the renewals need to be done, also be called second medical opinion. So if the family or the client feels like, they need another medical opinion, they can also formally ask for a second medical opinion while the client is in the hospital. So just to make sure that there is also another right that the family or the loved ones could exercise in case they have some disagreement or they want to have a second opinion done. And just want to emphasize the fact the Mental Health Act requires the facilities such as hospitals send written notice to the nearest relative, admission, discharge, application for review panel. There's no slacking on that. So they have to do it. We never had the strict governance around it. Now with the ombudsman audit, now the health authorities are kept accountable to make sure like this is getting done and should be done. And we need to get 100% compliance very soon. If not, there is some penalties and stuff and negative repercussion up to the CEO level for health authorities. Just a couple more slides and we talk about the mental health review board very broadly. I think if the clients feels like, they're just detained against their will and they want to kind of hear them out independently and get an opinion. And the review board is comprised of 3 people. One person we call chair or a judge with some legal or judicial background. The second person will be an independent physician. The third person will be a lay person from outside, from public. And they are appointed through this review board. A review board reports to the ministry, and they then conduct a review panel. So if the patient asks for a review panel, the review panel has to be done within 14 days after requesting for a review panel. So there's no slacking again in that. And that could be asked by a family or by a patient, or we call nearest relative. It could be one of them too. So the review panel, I heard why does the review panel have difference of opinion? They clearly have standards which they have to kind of follow and fulfill. Again, the balancing the charter rights and the Mental Health Act and safeguarding the rights of the client. It's very difficult to kind of go both extremes, and I see why sometimes the family feels like they're not heard. But the legal test is very clear. They have to fulfill those 4 criteria. And the review panel, if you look at the last 2 bullet points, the review panel also assess the risk of the patient if discharged as a result of mental disorder, will fail to follow up treatment. Did they have any history? And did the patient needs to be detained again under the Mental Health Act? And the review panel uses the 4 criteria, but also use the last 2 bullet points and to do the legal test and balance the probabilities. And they try to make a fairly good decisions, but not always like it may be favorable for all parties all the time. So the review panel, while doing this work, and we got another challenge. We got another court case, and we had another legal challenge on this called Tiswar versus British Columbia Review Board 2021, more recent. This has put a lot more pressure on the review panel hearing and how things are being interpreted. And one of the criteria we talked about was if the client have any serious impairment at the current time or a significant deterioration or a significant risk. Most times in the review panel, they used to take historical context. We talk about the nature of the illness, but now it's all coming into the degree or the severity of the illness, which means that they want to see evidence now, more recently, or evidence and history to show that clearly the patient may not fulfill some conditions when they go back to the community, like not taking medication, non-complying with the treatment. So it's not any more historical accounts. It has to be more recent. And again, they've not demarcated what the recent means, but that's what they're really requiring now, which also puts more pressure and challenge on the legal test. And some clients could slip through the nets because of this recent court case there. This is a flow chart for the review panel hearings. An external leave is and provision where we still have some safeguards, not just within hospital. The client goes back to community. There is a provision that client who has an history of non-compliance, some risk-taking behavior, or a potential deterioration or relapse, and the client may not have a full insight into to say take treatment, the client could be placed under the external leave. And external leave means that we could make sure that the client follows certain conditions, and if they don't follow condition, they could be taken back to hospital. Disclosure confidential is a big topic. I'm really hoping that maybe we can cover that in the question and answer session, but really very high level. So we normally would get a lot of difference of opinion, I would say, or understanding and interpretation of this, but clearly, even with the FIPA, like freedom of information and public protection, There are exceptions. So that's what I want to really clarify. There are always exceptions for confidentiality and disclosure. So if you look at one is the director must notify. We talked about that, admission, discharges, etc. They could also be notifying the loved ones for purpose of continuity of care. If the client is going back to the loved ones for staying there and taking medication or the previous history of harm or safety concern, they need to ensure that they follow up and talk to the loved one before discharge. And to protect the health and safety of patient or others. It's very broad again. So I think we can actually use this criteria to ensure who's under the Mental Health Act that the hospital or the provider need to take utmost step to reach all the necessary people to ensure, again, balance of probabilities versus doing the right thing, making sure the client in the client's best interest, but also making sure there's no safety or harm that is being done at the time of discharge, either to the client or to the family. And if there's no family, then we have a provision of public service trustee guardian, but that's still not fully functional, and that's still a way to go to kind of make that functional. Okay, these are the two documents I mentioned about the ombudsman thing. It's available, it's publicly available document. It really done a good job. And finally, it's a long time coming. And we're keeping the health authorities accountable going forward and making sure that people need to follow through with the right things. And I've got some references and which is very useful. And any questions or discussions, I'm happy to answer right now. Thank you. Sorry, I've taken a little bit more time than usual.
Wow, thank you very much. That was excellent. No, it's I think you touched on some really great points there as well, and I really appreciate you speaking and expanding on the physician's piece around protection and really giving some concrete examples. I think that's the big piece that family members struggle with, because at home they can clearly see that their loved one is deteriorating, they're not doing well, whether they've ever been in treatment or not. And you know, I think people don't really utilize that piece super effectively, if I may say it in those words. So I really appreciate you summarizing that and giving us some good examples around that. So we do have some Q&A questions coming in. Please continue to submit them in the chat box, or sorry, in the Q&A box, and we will get to them. If we don't, we will do our best to try to answer them for you via email. Specifically, if you've asked a question, we're not able to get to it. So I just wanted to touch upon a key point, which you mentioned in your presentation as well, around information sharing. So one of the big pieces is if someone gets to hospital and they're not admitted, at this point, they're still in the assessment process, and clearly the individual may be presenting okay for a doctor not to observe any psychotic symptoms or symptoms of whatever illness they may have. As we call it, person might be holding it together for that time. How does a family give that information? You mentioned in it that families can provide collateral information, and that's something that we encourage all our families to do as well, to be able to provide it. But who do they provide it to, and how do they share?
Yeah, it's a good question, Hardeep. I mean, there's no one size fits for all, because our healthcare system is quite different across the board in different neighborhoods and regions. But generally speaking, if the client is being taken to ER, I would just call the ER triage nurse and then ask them to be directed to where the client is and talk to the nurse in charge there. And many emergency room, they've also got psychiatric triage nurse for a certain number of hours. They're not 24 hours. The psychiatric triage nurses will be the first point of contact for any of the mental health cases.
You mentioned?
Yeah, they call. So if you can contact, PTN, we call them. So if you can call the switchboard and say we want to talk to PTN, the PTNs are not there. Usually they would just put them through the physician who is on call or the nurse who is in charge for the client at the time. So that'll be the right way to go. And then as much information you're able to give and reach out, and then give your number, give your contact, but ensure that if some information you don't want to be shared and not to be recorded, and make sure that you mention that clearly. But otherwise, it'll just go into the records and everything will be shared with the client or with the continuity of care with other healthcare providers.
Yes, excellent. Very, very good point. There is a lot of information sometimes that families do not wish to be shared with their loved one. So that's really critical information. So they can share, they can request that this information not be shared with their loved one. And that's respected, you're saying?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It should be respected. And if it's not respected, again, I wouldn't take a slack, and I would strongly encourage the families to raise a formal complaint, either through PCQO, and we shouldn't shy away. I mean, as health authority, I'm health authority leader, but the more feedbacks and opportunities we have to figure out which parts of the system is not working or where the gaps are, then we wouldn't know how to fix it and how to follow up. That will be my take on it too.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that clarification. So we have some questions here. Is who exactly sits on the review panel? Who are the members of society, or is there designated folks?
Yeah, so the review panel members, as I mentioned, they're appointed by this group of people. So although because the review panels are happening in multiple areas and multiple at the same time, and we have a pool of people, and they are appointed. Usually the review board chairs are appointed through the ministry. That's my understanding of it. And after the chairs are appointed, then they have this review board. The review board will then start to hire people for their layperson, for their physician, independent physician, and also a pool of backup, so that they can actually go back and go through who is available. So 3 people on the panel, and they all 3 are independent. And usually the recommendation, not usually, the strong recommendation is none of the review panel members should talk to the patient or to the healthcare facility prior to the review panel. So it's very important. It just happens on that particular day. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Great.
So it's be independent, and it's not unbiased decision making there.
Okay.
And one more.
Yeah.
One more thing, Hardeep. So, and also it's important to know that families could reach out, because this is where the facility need to notify the family or the nearest relative immediately after the review panel has been requested, and once we have the date fixed. I don't think many health authorities are doing a great job. So I think if the families don't hear about the review panel, then again, they should reach out and say, you know what, hey, we haven't heard. So you can look at the ombudsman committed to change the audit. It clearly shows and clearly sets standards. We've actually 2020, and there was a slap on the wrist for all health authorities, and they were clearly given standards what they have to follow. And then having the standards and reading that through is not very difficult to understand, but reading the document is going to be quite helpful. Or Schizophrenia Society could interpret some of the document and help them for their members.
Mm-hmm. And so family members certainly can submit their information as well when they're notified.
Yes, and they can also submit the information. They can be present in the review panel. Again, we want to always work with the client. We don't want to go against them. But if they don't want to be there, then they can also give the report because the physician will be giving the report. So the family is able to reach out and give the physician all the necessary information and the collateral. Right. That will help the physician, the facility, to put a strong case and why we need the treatment in the hospital.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question here. What do you think should be included with supportive housing to reduce the risk of someone becoming homeless when they struggle with the rules of the housing that they're currently in?
It's a great question. You know, I think, again, I heard from Honorable Minister Sheila Malcolmson talking about the complex care housing and potential support that need to be embedded within this for mental health with this housing areas. There's no right or wrong answer in this, because we're looking at the level of care. It's called step care model, even in the housing. So if the housing provider requires a lot more support and they have a lot more clients with complex mental health issues housed there, and then it's not a bad idea to have that ongoing connection with the mental health services through the health authority, and trying to negotiate that either with a primary care doctor or with an independent physician, or even working with health authority to kind of putting that care up if that care is not already there. But part of the complex care housing proposal is to provide that supports on an ongoing basis as they start to deliver those housing proposals going forward. So my hope would be that we're going to see a lot more strengthened wraparound care in many of these complex care housing areas, and which is currently quite thin and fragmented.
Yeah, no, it's definitely challenging for some of our folks to abide by some very strict regulations that are put in place, right? Clearly because of the illness sometimes. So I know I hear a lot of times from families that are having their loved ones lose their housing because they're not able to continue in that. So another question here is, how can we find data relating to the increase in BC prisoners with a diagnosed mental illness to the shortage of psychiatric hospital beds in the province? You mentioned that.
Well, again, good question. I mean, it's a research question, basically, what you're asking, or a ministry related question where they need to find data. So the BC Mental Health and Substance Use Services do have some data that's available on the BC incarcerated client population there, and who having a percentage of mental illness, what they have. So we currently are providing a new service called Community Transition Team. So this transition team is going to connect the mental health or mentally ill clients upon discharge during the transition phase. It's going to be there for all correctional centers going forward this year.
Okay.
So that's 3-month program, and they would provide addiction transition care and making sure they have a mental health transition care when they leave the corrections, and they will be connected hopefully to the right and appropriate service upon discharge from the correction facility. So looking at the data, you could reach out to BC Mental Health and see if it's an appropriate request. Then we can potentially share that and through the FIPA again. And otherwise we could figure out like how to get the data. We don't have a current research data that's available in BC that's readily available publicly.
Yes, okay, good suggestion. Most patients with severe psychotic disorders, unless they're part of an EPI program or the forensics program, they don't receive adequate psychoeducation about their illness. And this lack of education influences their decision not to continue with necessary medications. How can this lack of appropriate psychoeducation be addressed?
Well, again, it's an excellent question. So if I have a few $1 million now, and I would really put into the psychosocial support for the clientele, because it's very important for anybody with mild, moderate, severe mental illness to get that psychoeducation / psychotherapy or CBT or DBT that is really required. Currently, a public health service or public health don't provide that free of charge. So we all know that that's a gap. I think the ministry are actively looking at it, and I'm involved in a few working groups. I'm hoping that we would see that progress, and we'll be able to see some formal funded programs for all the British Columbians, who have mild, moderate, and severe mental illness going forward. And if you don't feel that psychoeducation at the team level is addressed, even within the current team, although they are having teams, sometimes the team may not have those psychoeducation related or psychotherapy related work done. Again, as a loved ones, families, and I would strongly advocate that they need to get a wraparound service, including psychoeducation, psychotherapy, and medication. But the publicly funded model is a challenge for us right now, and hopefully, we can move forward. And any strong advocacy from BCSS or public and family of loved families going to the ministry and saying that we need a publicly funded psychotherapy model that is required for the province, which is there in most Western societies except us.
So typically at a community mental health center level, there isn't the time to do the psychoeducation piece. It's not, or it's just not built into that piece. It's more for specialized programs. Yeah, specialized program definitely have some psychologists and other they have also more time. We have to see that the people are pretty stretched with things. They're constantly kind of firefighting with all the factors taken into account. So they do have an ability to do it, and I don't want to kind of put my colleagues down and without knowing which program. My suggestion would be they have an ability to do it. They should be providing the basic psychoeducation about their illness. If they are with the team, there's no question why they can't do it or shouldn't do it. If they are having a gap, please reach out and address and ask questions why that's not happening. And there's also a lot of stuff that's available online, and they may not be all available through the mental health teams. And again, BCSS could be another avenue to reach out and get some of those resources and education materials regarding the psychoeducation areas. Yeah, we do psychoeducation for family members, but we haven't got a program in place to address that with people with lived experience. Yeah, I'd love to see, let's say we have my wish list will be to have 100 or 200 hours of psychotherapy available for all British Columbians under the public healthcare system. So, and if you have that, I think it'd be a good way to go and a good segue in early intervention, not just always looking at medication all the time. Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of components to it, not just medication. Absolutely. So I'm just going to ask the last question now, and then if we didn't get to your questions, I apologize. We will certainly answer it. Who fills out form 15, 16, or 17? And what if the patient refuses due to paranoia surrounding the family, meaning sending the form to the family? Well, it's not uncommon. We do have a lot of patients who want the family members to be involved. They could be paranoia, or they don't want the family to be involved.
Like I said, the nearest relative have to be nominated. So the facility have to take enough steps to nominate the nearest relative. That's Form 15. It's a social worker on the unit's responsibility in most hospitals. That's the designated person to do that work on Form 15. Sometimes the nurses do it if they don't have social workers. And that's done in conjunction with the patient first. The patient is unable to do that, then the team should reach out to the family to figure out like who could be the nearest relative, who could be the next of kin to kind of get that work done. Form 16 is the notification. It's just a notification basically coming out. It should come from the director or a designated deputy, we call it. Again, it could be coming from the manager on the unit, or it could be the nurse, depending on who the designated deputy is on the unit. And Form 17, we're talking about that's kind of notification related to the review panel. And so that comes quite later. And again, it has to come from the unit, which my strong suggestion is if you don't get 15, 16, and 17, only we ask for a review panel. 15 and 16, you don't know what's happening, please reach out to the unit, talk to the healthcare manager there, and then ask what's happening so that you can be involved in it.
Thank you very
And if the
much.
paranoia surrounding the family is there, so that, again, I talked about it. So that can be overruled because of safety concern here and protection. So I think we can overrule that. Confidentiality can be overruled and the family could be involved here in this case.
Excellent. Okay, perfect. So if anybody does have any questions around the things we've discussed today, please reach out to one of your local educators. We are all well versed at the BC Schizophrenia Society to help advocate for families around these topics. So we can certainly work with you more one-on-one if you are experiencing some struggles with your loved ones. So just a reminder about that, even if we didn't get to you today, or if we weren't able to fully answer your question today. So I just want to take a moment to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. As you know, time has escaped us very, very quickly. And, you know, it's always exciting when we talk about this because I think it really helps our families. But again, time is short and we wanted to make sure that we all leave time for people to answer our survey that we have. It will pop up for you once you're leaving. So please take a moment just to give us feedback. It's really important that we have that information so we can, you know, help facilitate the next AGM or any other events that we bring to you. Yeah, so if you just have a moment, please share that information with us just as you're signing out. We really appreciate you for joining us, and certainly thank you, Dr. Seethapathy, for taking the time to explain the information so eloquently to all of us. For Dr. Randall White, who also succinctly put that into a video for us, and we will have it on our website, I believe, for people who missed it or want to find out more information, more detailed points about it as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And if you wish to share this information with your loved ones or want to watch any of this information again, we will have a recording of this session up on our website at www.bcss.org. So just our regular website. We will put it up just as soon as we're able to. And I'd also like to take a chance to, I also like to take a moment to say thank you again to our generous sponsors, AbbVie, for making this AGM possible. And just a reminder about the membership. So if you're not a member, please consider joining us. It's really important that we have strength in numbers to help move our plight forward. And it's $15 for the month or for the year for membership. So please consider joining us. And if you have any personal stories, please reach out to your educator in your local community. We're not looking for stories only from the Lower Mainland. So anywhere across the province, please share. It really helps other people to realize that they're not alone, and there definitely is hope. I truly believe that with our members, the amazing staff that we have throughout the province, from Haida Gwaii to the East Kootenays and Vancouver Island to the Cariboo and Fort St. John, 2 dedicated boards and our donors, we certainly can do anything. Thanks for being here.